likely, folks. You're just nearly plumb out of inspiration, so y'all are lucky. Okay, I would like to start tonight. I try to throw lots of good information at you all. And that's helpful academically, but tonight I really want to start in a different place. And that is on the emotional end of this. I have to tell you that I have had emotionally a rough day. And it came from studying this stuff. And I think it harks back to a couple of episodes earlier in my life, back when I was in full-time ministry. I used to collect data on the city of Lubbock, where I live, and even specifically down to the neighborhood level in the neighborhood where I live, because the Lord had given me a heart for my neighborhood. And one day I had assembled all this information, this demographic information that the city had collected from census records from, I forget what year it was, probably like 2000, and then 1990 and 1980 and 1970, every 10 years, the big national census. And as I was looking at that information, I was in a great big office room on a 19th-story building in downtown Lubbock, and I had these books spread out on a table, a long table, so I could literally walk and read and compare what had happened to different categories of information regarding people in my neighborhood. And I came down to the section where it dealt with what had happened to the structure of two-parent families versus one-parent families with kids, and so forth and so on. And as I read from like 1970 toward 2000, I remember looking at the incredible rate of the collapse of the two-parent home in my neighborhood. And as I walked, I began to feel faintly sick, and then I began to feel a little bit more than faintly sick. And I literally had to stop and pack up my things and go home because I was ill. I was physically ill from the emotional trauma of what was happening to my neighborhood before my very eyes. It broke my spirit. There's a price in caring, isn't there? And today, as I was going over this material, I was reminded that I used to love my nation, and I still do, but I have tried to close my heart to my nation because watching what is happening to my nation is, quite frankly, too painful. Let me give you an illustration. Suppose you are a conscientious Christian family member, and you have a dissolute old uncle. We'll call him Joe. Joe's an alcoholic. And Joe is bent on self-destruction. And you kind of feel responsible for Joe, even though, he's just your uncle. He's not really your kid. But you know that if somebody didn't help Joe out, he's going to kill himself because he's down at the bar every night drinking till closing time. And then he tries to drive himself home, which is not recommended by the Surgeon General. And so you have spent years, literally years, running interference for Joe. Night after night, when you need to be with your family, you have gone up there at closing time when you desperately needed your sleep, and you've wrestled the keys away from him and convinced him to let you drive him home. And this has gone on to the point that it has worn you out emotionally. It's wearing you down physically. You are just about to come apart trying to handle your own family, plus Joe. And so one day, at the, in the dead of night, as the bar is closing, you're back down there and you're trying to get the keys away from Joe once again. And he's really hostile and he's threatening to fight you. How dare you treat me this way like I'm a kid? And suddenly something breaks inside of you. Suddenly, emotionally, something breaks inside of you. And you manage to get the keys, but then you just turn around and say, all right, Joe, here's the keys. Goodbye, Joe. What has happened? In that moment, the struggle has become too much. The load is simply too much, and you've given up. And you know that you may not see Joe alive again. He may run into that tree tonight, or it could be tomorrow night. But you know what's going to happen. You just can't predict exactly when. But what you did when you said goodbye to Joe was you were closing off your heart. You were sealing off that place so that you would die to Joe before he died on you. Tragic, isn't it? When I study this part of the book of Judges, and I make the mistake of thinking too much, I'm reminded of where our country is and what's happening. And I thought I'd close my heart off good. Well, I learned different today. Today, I went back down to the bar and tried to wrestle the keys away from Joe again, emotionally speaking. Today, I had to stop studying because my heart hurt so much. So before we go into this, it's my purpose is to make you, by the end of this session, as miserable as I have been. Let me see if I can bring something up to share with you. Okay, not that. Okay, share screen. All right, here we go. These are the words to a wonderful hymn. And I want you to hold on to this because we're going to look at some really, really desperately despairing stuff tonight. And I want to remind you that however much you love your country or your family or someone in your life who may not be in a safe place eternally, if you belong to Jesus, you have a foundation that cannot be destroyed. And you need to hold on to these words, deep and strong. Pardon me. How firm a foundation, ye saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his excellent word. What more can he say than to you he hath said, to you who for refuge to Jesus have fled? Fear not, I am with thee. Oh, be not dismayed, for I am thy God and will still give thee aid. I'll strengthen thee, help thee, and cause thee to stand, upheld by my righteous, omnipotent hand. By the way, if you're wondering where these stanzas come from, if you read Isaiah 43, verses 1 through 7, you'll discover that this comes straight out of that text. When through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace all sufficient shall be thy supply. The flame shall not hurt thee. I only design thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine. The soul that on Jesus hath leaned to repose, I will not desert to his foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never, no, never forsake. Okay. Can you all on Zoom see the text of Judges 17 now?
No, sorry.
No, sir.
Okay. Then I
David,
will.
thank you for sharing that.
Oh, you are most welcome. Nope. Try again. How about now?
No, sir.
Okay. All right. So let me just start the share screen again. And figure out why. All right, how about now?
Yes, sir.
All right, we have liftoff. Okay. I was noticing something here. I think I will exclude that. No need to go into that right now. Okay, we are moving into the end game. Folks, last time, 2 weeks ago, that seems like an eternity ago, right? We looked at the story of Samson. And you may recall, those of you who were present, how Samson, who was prepared for with greater care than any other judge in the entire story, he was to be a Nazirite. God gave his parents explicit instructions. He was given every advantage, set apart for God's purposes. And he spent his entire, his entire earthly life thumbing his nose at God, at God's law, and God's will. He violated his Nazirite vow every way he could think of, and probably unintentionally several ways more. And the irony was, the worse he was, the more God seemed to be with him. And the more he misbehaved, the more God used his misbehavior to deliver Israel from the Philistines. But the problem was that the day came when God looked at Samson and he said, okay, Joe, here's the keys. You drive yourself home. We're done. Goodbye, Joe. There was a time when God had had enough. There is a time when his patience is exhausted and he can take no more. And he seals off his heart and his help. Today, we're going to look at a slice of life in Israel from a time when they were about where I would judge America to be in its own descent right now. And I can't help but think of the words of Jesus as he stood on the Mount of Olives coming into the city, and he said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I longed to gather you together as a hen covers her chicks, and you were not willing. Behold, your house is left to you desolate." What's he saying? He says, I'm not coming down to the bar to drive you home anymore. My protection has been lifted off of you. My blessing is not there to save you from your own suicidal tendencies anymore. My protection is gone. It's like the first day, after the premium that you paid on your insurance policy runs out, and then the next day something happens, and guess what? You ain't covered. Okay. On to the story. This story is one of the most remarkable pieces of literature in the entire Bible. It is incredibly artful. It is incredibly well written, and it's incredibly sad. And it gets fairly convoluted, so it will help at the beginning of the story if we recognize there are three major players. And if you keep these players straight in your mind, then you won't get lost in the details. If you try to read it fast, it begins to spin around and around and loses shape. But if you remember these three characters, then it'll all come clear to you. The story has 3 acts, 3 chapters. The first act involves a man by the name of Micah. These days we call him Mike, right? And Mike is short for Mikael, for Michael, right? Which is essentially what this man's name was. Mikael means who is like El, who is like, that's the name for God. Elohim, El. Mikael means who is like God. But Micah in the Bible, his name is actually longer. It's Mikayahu or Mikayehu, which means who is like Yahweh. Not just God in the generic, but God by his personal name. So his name is who is like Yahweh. But through most of this, in verses 1 and 4, we get the long form, Mikayahu. But in every other place in this story, the name is cut back to his familiar name. Instead of calling him Michael, we call him Mike. The irony is, when we shorten a name in English, you don't really lose anything because in English, names don't really mean anything anyway, right? In Hebrew, they do. So when you shorten Mikayahu to Micah, you know what it now means? It just means who is like. What got deleted? God did. When you shorten Michael to Mike, guess what you took out? L. You took out God's name. Ironically, that's exactly what happens in this story. His name got abbreviated, and it was a potent and eloquent illustration of exactly what happened in his life. There is, let me see if I can find it here. We'll get to that. Okay. About the art in this story, it is not really apparent to us as Americans because we're distant from the culture where this happens. But to illustrate the power of a brief story that leaves you with a gap to fill, I'll tell you a story, a fairly famous story from the life of Winston Churchill. Famously, Winston Churchill had an adversarial relationship with a woman of the nobility in England whose name was Lady Astor. They were constantly after each other and trading insults. And one day when Churchill was somewhat inebriated in public, he encountered Lady Astor, who said, "Winston, you're drunk." To which she replied, "Lady Astor, you're ugly. And tomorrow I will be sober." Now, in many forms of that joke, it goes on to say, "But tomorrow you will still be ugly." But you see, by the shorter form, and Winston was a master of wit, by using the shorter form, he leaves the audience in their own minds to fill in the "and tomorrow you will be ugly." And it's funnier because you have left that little gap that the audience completes. This is the power of illusion. In many stories of the past, great literature in English would make all kinds of subtle allusions to biblical, and of course, there weren't 1,000 versions back then. There was the King James. So writers like Dante or the writer who did Paradise Lost, Milton, they could throw in all these cute, subtle little references to Scripture. And if you knew Scripture, whole worlds of ideas opened up through that subtle little illusion that other people didn't get. And you could go there because you knew the story behind the story. Well, this particular story is chock full of irony that is based on what he doesn't tell you, he only hints at. And I'm going to have to spoil the joke by explaining the joke. It will still be good, but it wouldn't be as good as if you had been an Israelite and you would have caught it just by filling in the gap. Still, it's pretty remarkable. All right, let's read the first 6 verses here. After all, we do have 2 chapters to get through today. There was a man. Notice no more judges. We're done with the judges. God isn't going to send any more judges. Here's the keys, Joe. No more deliverers. There was a man of the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micaiah, who is like Yahweh. And he said to his mother, "The 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse, and you also spoke it in my ears, behold, the silver is with me. I took it." Uh-oh. By the way, there are 2 parallels between this story and the story of Samson that is immediately before it. Number 1, this 1,100 pieces of silver. Do you remember that each of the Philistine lords, the 5 lords, gave exactly this amount as a bribe, as a reward to Delilah for delivering up Samson? And Samson was from the tribe of Dan. This story is going to be about Dan. This story is basically going to be about the tribe of Dan. So here's the situation. Micah has taken an enormous amount of money from his very wealthy mom, from his own mother. He has robbed his own mother. And if you think that doesn't happen, have you ever met a drug addict who wouldn't steal from his or her mother? Addiction is a powerful thing, even if the addiction is just to money. Scrooge, Uncle Scrooge would have stolen from his mama duck, what I'm saying. The problem is, Micah was perfectly happy having stolen the money from his mama, and he probably even helped her look for it. Until she pronounces a curse on whoever took it. She is really, really hot. And the curse that whoever took this money, I hope that, I pray that, I declare, whatever the curse was, it scared Micah pretty bad. He did not want to be the one on whom that curse landed. So all of a sudden he's going, maybe I should fess up to this one. And so he does. Mom, about that 1100 silver. My bad. I took it. I'll give it back to you. Immediately, his mother said, blessed be my son by the Lord. Oh, now that she knows it's her baby boy that took it, she's kind of worried that curse is going to land on him too. So she tries to nullify the curse by blessing it out of existence. You know, plus or minus algebra, right? Cancel out. And we don't know what the curse said because we don't have the verbiage, but she blesses her son by the name of Yahweh, which is fitting because the thief in this instance has a name which means who is like Yahweh. Well, clearly not Micah. Verse 3. And he restored the 1100 pieces of silver to his mother. And his mother said, I dedicate the silver to Yahweh from my hand for my son to make a carved image and a metal image. Excuse me? Huh? We'll bypass that for now. We'll come back to that. Now, therefore, I will restore it to you. Verse 4. So when he restored the money to his mother took not 1100 pieces, but 200 pieces of the total and gave it to the silversmith, who made it into a carved image and a metal image. And it was in the house of Micah. If at this point you're scratching your head and going, what? My spidey sense tells me there's something wrong here. Your spidey sense should be going totally crazy if you know the law of Moses at all by this point. Verse 5. And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod. Who else did that? Gideon, I believe, out of gold that was taken from the earrings of the Midianites. He made an ephod and household gods, not just the main idol, but lots of little idols to surround it. These have made an appearance in scripture before too. You may recall that when Rachel and Leah were making an unannounced departure from their daddy's house, when Jacob fled during the night, Rachel stole the household gods. And when Laban came storming after them and accused them of the theft, she hid the fact that she had stolen them by sitting on them in her tent and claiming that the way of women was upon her. Forgive me, I cannot get up. And verse 5, Micah also ordained one of his sons who became his priest. Almost a parenthetical statement, verse 6. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This is a weird story, folks. Weird. You know, we're in serious, strange place here. I'm going to let a commentator comment briefly on this story. On the good side, we're going to do like an accounting balance sheet here of virtues versus vices in the story here. As this commentator, whose name is Block, he's a blockhead, but he's an academic blockhead, Ivy League blockhead. He's really quite good. So he says there are 4 positive attributes that are given to Micah in this story. Let me see, 478. Here we are. First, the main character bears a thoroughly good Orthodox Yahwistic name, Mikayehu, or Yahoo, which means who is like Yahweh. Unlike Samson, who's apparently named after the sun god, this guy has a name that honors Jehovah, that honors Yahweh. That's a good thing. Number 2, Micah confesses his sin to his mother and returns the goods he stole from her. That he stole them was not a good thing, but if you have stolen something, well, it's certainly a good thing to confess it and return it. I noticed that Dave Langford is not in the audience tonight. He used to tell a story about how he and his daddy went down to the comic store or to the drugstore, and when they got home, his dad noticed a folded comic sticking up out of his son's pocket that he didn't remember paying for. Dave is now the preacher here at the church, and it's a shame that your preacher, you folks from Quaker, is a thief from a very young age. Probably the value of the comic was less than 1,100 shekels of silver, but nonetheless, Dave tells a story about a rather painful return trip to the store where amends were duly made. So that was the second thing. He confessed his sin, returned the money. That's a good thing. Third, after Micah returns the stolen goods to his mother, she blesses him by the name of Yahweh. That sounds positive. That's a good development. Fourth, Micah's mother solemnly consecrates the money to Yahweh. That sounds like a good thing, right? So far, so good. She seems to be hitting on all cylinders. So you expect at this point a positive outcome to the story. Okay, a man gave into temptation. He stole money, but he has confessed his sin. He's returned the money. His mom has blessed him in the name of the Lord, and now she's dedicating all this silver, which was a huge sum of money. I think when we talked about the 1,100 shekels of silver from 5 rulers, that it would be something like 550 years of average annual wage for the time. So this amount was well over 100 years worth of salary. This is a huge amount of money. I have several 1-ounce rounds of silver, not quite this many, but I have several. They're not worth that much right now, but anyway, one can always dream. Unfortunately for Micah and his mother, the 4 positive signals that we've just seen in the story are counterbalanced by 8 negative signals, which leaves us on the deficit side of the moral equation, for sure. Number 1, in spite of all the piety expressed in his name, in the action of stealing from his mama, Micah manages to violate fully 1/5 of the 10 commandments. 20% of them, all at once, right? What are those? He violates number 5, which is honor your father and mother. Violated that one pretty good, stomped all over it. And then number 8, thou shalt not steal, right? And if we were a prosecutor looking to really pile up the charges, we could throw in number 10 too, thou shalt not covet. That came before the stealing. So number 1, he has already thoroughly trampled the law of God in his behavior. And by the way, according to the law of Moses, he probably should not only have returned what was stolen, but added 1/5 to its value. Number 2, second negative thing, Micah's motive in returning the stolen goods is suspect. When was it that he returned the stolen goods? What caused that? That's right. He didn't return it until a curse was made and he started worrying about the consequences. The writer, I forget his name, The Longest Day, the guy that did what became a movie of World War II, of D-Day, The Longest Day, that story, the book that was based on contains a remarkable account of a young man who had a Catholic upbringing, and he was stuck on board ship with everybody else. It was big secret when they were going to invade and where. And so they're waiting for the weather to clear, and all these soldiers are cooped up on the ships and they can't get off, so nobody can loose lip sink ships thing. Well, there was a poker game going on, and this Catholic boy let himself get allured into participating in a game that from his upbringing he should have regarded as sinful. Well, he sat down at table and he started winning every hand. He won pot after pot after pot after pot of money until, according to his recorded recollection of that day, he said, I sat there staring at more money than I had ever seen in one place before. And he's sitting there not able to believe his good fortune when suddenly, he's taking it back to his bunk to put it beneath the mattress. And he suddenly thinks to himself, I'm about to hit a beach that is filled with mines and German guns. And there's a decent chance that I am not going to survive the next 48 hours. How will I face God with all this ill-gotten gain stuffed beneath my mattress? Suddenly he got real scared. Conviction fell on that poor boy, so strong that he said he went back to the table and continued to gamble until he had literally lost the entire pot on purpose, just in case he died. And the irony was he didn't die, so he should have kept it. Well, Micah was worried, so he gave the money back. But his reason for doing so was not particularly honorable. Number 3, as pious as the woman's dedication of the silver to Yahweh appears, she does not present the money to the priests at Shiloh like she should have done. If it's given to Yahweh, then you give it to the priests. Instead, she gives it to a craftsman, an artisan, and not all of it, mind you. Turns out that she dedicated 1,100 pieces. She only parted with 200. Can anybody say Ananias and Sapphira? She gives it to a silversmith. She gives the money back to her son, and it's okay. And 4th, even though she dedicates the silver to Yahweh, when it comes to engaging the silversmith, she doesn't give him the full amount. She just gives him 200. By the way, 200 shekels of silver would come out to about 80 ounces or 5 pounds of silver. Just 5 pounds is all it would actually be in terms of weight, which means that the idol that was made was not some big imposing idol. It was a little guy, not that impressive. Wonder what happened to that other 900. 5th, the woman's intention in dedicating the silver flies in the face of the 2nd commandment. I mean, Micah's already gone and tromped all over the 6th and the 8th, right? Well, now Mama's going to break the 2nd commandment, which is, you shall make no graven image. So she has dedicated this silver to Yahweh. This silver is holy. And so what do they do with holy silver? They turn it into an idol. If there is a way to mess up more than this family is doing, I'd like to know what it is. Now, you'll notice the writer, the storyteller, does not bring any of this out. He doesn't stop and say, see what they do. He's playing Winston Churchill. He's just smiling and grinning. He's just telling you the bare facts and leaving you to recognize what an incredible nonsense is going on here in the name of Yahweh. 6th, Micah builds an entire cult shrine. It's not just that he has an idol. He sets up an entire worship center. You know, he orders the pews from whatever church magazine you get them from. He sets up his own tabernacle. Let's take a quick side trip to Deuteronomy chapter 12. He's just in the first 3 verses, he said, here's how the Canaanites worship. Here's all the stuff they do. Verse 4 says, you shall not worship the Lord that way. But verse 5, you shall seek the place the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go. This was a cult of where. Where was very important. You don't just under any spreading tree or on any hilltop you choose. God will choose a place, and that's the place where you do your worship. Verse 6, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and the contribution you present, your vow offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and flock, not to mention your 1,100 shekels of silver. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake, in which God has blessed you. Verse 8, you shall not do according to all that we are doing here today, everyone doing whatever is right in his own eyes. Familiar? Whatever is right in your own eyes is not recommended by the heavenly Surgeon General. 4, you have not as yet come to the rest and the inheritance that the Lord your God is giving you. When you go over the Jordan and live in the land the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and when he gives you rest from all your enemies and you live in safety, then to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell there, There you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, contribution, and all your finest vow offerings. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons, etc., etc., etc. Notice verse 13. Take care that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place that you see, but at the place the Lord will choose in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I'm commanding you. Is it clear enough yet? So where is the place that God chose for his name to dwell? Everybody says Jerusalem, right? And that is correct. But it was not Jerusalem to start with. It was Shiloh. Shiloh was a little place in Ephraim, a handful of miles from Micah's house, where the ark of the tabernacle, the tent with the ark and God's priests, the whole setup was at Shiloh. A decent day's walk from Micah's house. And now Micah sets up his own little shrine at home, because after all, doing church by Zoom is so much more convenient. To update the image. By the way, those of you who are on Zoom right now, that was not a poke at you. Jerusalem is a long plane ride away from any of us, and we're not under the law of Moses, thankfully. But you see how specific God was about this. A lot of people don't recognize that. What? Not only are we dealing with an idol, which was absolutely forbidden, but we're dealing with a location in Micah's own home where he has his own little temple. And this was a massive violation of God's purpose and will. All right, let's return to Judges, to the scene of the judge's crime. One moment. Okay, there we go. Nope, I'm gonna move that right over here. Okay. So that was the first act. Micah and the incredible mess he made, along with his mother, of doing, no, I haven't actually haven't. No, I'm going to save that for the next part. There's another irony here, but we're going to wait on that. So, it's like, have you ever been in a movie where there's an opening scene and you get introduced to this set of characters, and then all of a sudden you jump to a whole new set of characters and you go, wait, what happened to my story? So you get to know the new set of characters, and then at the third scene, the two groups kind of meet. They interact. This is what's happening here. We've got the story of Micah and his mama. Now we're introducing a new character in verse 7, Act 2. Now, there was a young man of Bethlehem in Judah. Some of you probably heard of Bethlehem. Think real hard. Of the family of Judah, who was a Levite. This means he was living in Judah, but he was not from the tribe of Judah. He was from the tribe of Levi. He was from the priestly tribe. But he sojourned, meaning he was temporarily living there. And the man departed from the town of Bethlehem in Judah to sojourn wherever he could find a place. And as he journeyed, he came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the local Motel 6, which happened to be the house of Micah. So here's a Levite who's apparently having trouble making a living. Now, Levites should not have had trouble making a living. Why?
Supported by the other.
In theory, Levites had a pool of resources that came from the offerings and the sacrifices that were brought to God. But what happens if you're a pastor and your people don't tithe? You get thin is what happens. So your South Beach diet is your own people's unwillingness to give. Right? So here's a Levite who is struggling to make a living, probably because the Israelites were not bringing the offerings. So what you going to do? You're going to sit there and starve? No, you're going to go get a job at the 7-Eleven, even if you are a Levite. So he was in Bethlehem. Things did not work out in Bethlehem. So he's going. Where is he going? He doesn't know where he's going. He's looking for a job. And not having the Jerusalem Times to open up to the classified section, he's just going on the road to see if he can find sustenance. On the way, he comes to Micah's house. Verse 9. And Micah said to him, where do you come from? And he said to him, I am a Levite of Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to sojourn where I may find a place. How's that for specificity? Where are you going? Search me, beats me. I'm just looking for a living. Suddenly, Micah has this light bulb come on over his head. He gets an idea. If this were Saturday morning cartoons, you would see the light bulb right over Micah's head. And Micah said to him, stay with me and be to me a father and a priest, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year and a suit of clothes in your living. And the Levite went in. And the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. A couple of things to notice here. Number one, what's the Levite's name? We don't know. He's just an anonymous Levite. He's a guy. And not only is a guy, he is a very young guy. Notice this young man. It says that he was a young man. Na'ar in the Hebrew represents a youth. Now, this was significant because a Levite or a priest had to be 30 years of age before he could enter into his priestly duties. You had to have a certain maturity. They didn't believe in young wet behind the ears 18-year-old preachers in Israel. Maybe we shouldn't either. I don't know. I would have been disqualified. I started pretty early. And anyway, they want a little maturity. So probably what this means was this Levite was younger than 30. By the way, there is another reference in Numbers 8 where the number seems to be 25. So there seems to be a little discrepancy there. Maybe you could start at 25. Maybe it was 30. Either way, this guy probably didn't qualify. He's a kid. And that's what makes this tremendous irony when Micah says, I know, I've got a bright idea. Why don't you be to me a father and a priest? You ever looked at a kid and said, would you be my daddy? What's going on here? Micah is way older than this kid, probably. The term father is an honorific. It is a title that you would give, like the word pastor, elder. Have you ever noticed that in the Mormon church, the average age of an elder is probably 19 and a half? It's like that. Things that make you go, So there's this irony built in. Micah is saying to a man who might not even be old enough to drink legally in modern society, will you be to me a father? And I'll give you 10 pieces of silver a year. By the way, if this was a good salary, 10 pieces of silver a year, imagine stealing 1,100. Now do you begin to get an idea? Well, that works. I mean, what are the Levites' options? I mean, what's plan B? Keep wandering? Sounds good from here. So, verse 12. Oh, and by the way, verse 11 says, the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons that he calls father. This whole thing is just draped in irony. Verse 12, and Micah ordained the Levite, and the young man became his priest and was in the house of Micah. Now, Micah already had a priest in his little shrine. Remember what he did? Who was his first priest? His own son. I wonder if he called him father. Well, how would you like it if your daddy has, maybe you're the firstborn, so you get the honor. You're now the priest. You've got the ephod. You've got the robes. You've been appointed. Boy, you have status. And then one day your daddy comes along and says, sorry to tell you this, but I need those robes back. I've got a better priest. You have been out-qualified. I now have a USDA grade I genuine Levite. But Dad, I wonder how the son felt. By the way, we didn't even get to this in that first part, but another violation that Micah committed besides having an idol shrine, his son was not a Levite. His son was not from the tribe of Levi. His son had no right to be a priest. You couldn't be a priest unless you were from the tribe of Levi and from the family of Aaron. So Micah has messed up 6 ways to Sunday and probably did worse on the weekend. Now, Micah seems to be completely ignorant, but he's not so ignorant but what he knows that a Levite's better than the next best thing. Now he's got a Levite. Now he is in high cotton. Sorry, those of you who aren't from Lubbock. That would mean things are really swell. And here is the stumper, the last verse in the chapter. Then Micah said, now I know that Yahweh will bless me, will prosper me, because I've got a Levite, by priest. What Micah didn't know was he had angered God every possible way that there was to anger God. He had messed up every possible way and was busy inventing more. The tragedy was he was blissfully ignorant of the whole business. Here was a guy that could not be doing worse, and if he tried, and he was completely ignorant of the problem. He literally thought, now that he had a Levite as priest, that God was going to just bless his socks off. Well, his socks were going to come off, but not from blessing. Here, folks, is a tragedy. I would suggest to you that we have arrived at a point in our society where not just the unchurched people in the United States, but the churched people are violating God's will in the most unbelievably and explicit ways, and to a very large degree are completely clueless about that fact. We are eating and drinking judgment upon ourselves, to use one scriptural reference, and we don't even have the slightest clue that we are offending God. Now, if the church is that ignorant, what possible hope is there for everybody else? That seems to be a strong statement. If you stick around to our last session, I'll try to justify that statement. You won't like it much, but I'll read you some Bible. This is what breaks my heart. It's one thing if you're a little bit further up in the process and you could say, well, I know between you and me, I know that I'm messing up, but I just try to put a good face on it. When you're still at that point, you at least can still repent and find your way back. But when you reach the point that you are so self-deceived that you've lost even your basic orientation about what's up and what's down, what's moral and what's not, what's right and what's wrong, at that point, you can't find your way back. At that point, it's like when you've used 51% of your fuel in an airplane, you are not getting back to where you started. Micah was royally screwed, and he didn't even know it. Are we? That seems like an excellent time to take a bathroom break. 5 minutes. I'll see you back at 6:30.
Brother David, before you go,
Okay.
quick thing. Would you assume that at this point, if they weren't tithing, they must not have had readings of the law anymore? Isn't it like that? I can't remember. Was it King Josiah when they found the reading of the law and he rent his clothes because he realized that they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing? Do you think it was like that at this time in Israel?
I do. I think they were much like us. There have never been more Bibles in existence in a country anywhere in the world than there are right now. And the vast majority of them are collecting dust. We are, like I've said, if California ever does break off from a major earthquake and sink beneath the waves, it won't be because of an earthquake in the falls. It will be from the sheer weight of Bibles. We have a famine of the knowledge of God in the midst of the greatest plenty the world has ever seen. There has never been a society on earth that has less excuse for abandoning God. And that's why the judgment on our nation will be particularly severe. Yeah, I think that's exactly. They stopped reading. It's not that they didn't have the law, but they stopped reading it. They stopped caring. And so they reached a point where even their sincere ignorance was an insult. Well, more on that in a minute. Be sure to tune in for the next exciting episode, 6:30.
Brother David,
But yes,
before you get started, I just want to make sure that you mark me as here. I'm sorry, I was a little late joining. Annette.
Annette,
Mm-hmm.
I will do that. I was just looking to bring up my uh, to find my attendance deal.
Thank you.
I surely will.
There's another Churchill story you probably heard. Don't know who the woman was, but this woman from Churchill said, "If you were my husband, I would poison you."
Yes,
And Churchill said, "Man, if I was your husband, I'd drink."
I drink it. Absolutely.
Some ladies told Winston Churchill said, "If you were my husband, I would poison you." Churchill said, "If I was your husband, I'd drink it." Someone had over 64 years of chick. He said, "Yeah, and you know, it's got 100 years ago." Yeah, they're conditioner on, and then you go here, and you go back there, and you go on the building, all closed up. Yeah, it's cold, safe. Yeah.
Okay, folks, we are going to enter the third act. Remember, in Act 1, we were introduced to Micah and his mother. In Act 2, a nameless Levite looking for a job comes wandering into the picture, winds up staying the night at Micah's house, and ends up being employed by Micah as the priest for his idol shrine. Now, I don't know if it occurred to you or not, But theoretically, a Levite who is a servant of Yahweh, who is part of a tribe that is committed to the worship of Yahweh, would have known that if he is being asked to serve as a priest at a shrine that is not Shiloh, that is not where the ark is, and that there's an idol in that shrine, that this situation is wrong every possible way. If he was a Levite, surely he would know better, right? You know what this Levite says? Sounds good to me. Sounds good to me. There's money in it. So this Levite is just as crooked and just as ignorant as anybody else. All right, chapter 3 or act 3. Now we're going to shift scenes again, and we're going to add one more party to this putrid picture. Verse 1. In those days, there was no king in Israel. We've already heard that once in this passage, haven't we? He doesn't add the part about eyes, but this is a shortened form. And in those days, the tribe of the people of Dan was seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in. For until then, no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. Now, that doesn't mean that there hadn't been a lot. You know, they cast lots, and each of the tribes was given a geography, a territory. But if you remember back in chapter 1, some of the tribes had difficulty conquering the land or the territory that was to be given, that was to be their home. And the tribe that had the most trouble was the tribe of Dan. They basically were not able to conquer any of the inheritance that belonged to them, except for maybe about 2 cities, because the Amorites in the plain, by the way, their territory was between the tribe of Benjamin and the Mediterranean, to the west of Benjamin. Most of it was the lowland where those pesky Amorites had those terrible iron chariots. And so the people of Dan were basically crowded up into the hill country where the chariots couldn't operate, right on the border of Judah and Benjamin, in 2 cities called Zorah and Eshtaol, which, by the way, is kind of where Samson came from, because he was from the tribe of Dan. So they're still looking, since they can't conquer the area that was supposed to be theirs, they're looking for another place. Verse 2. So the people of Dan sent 5 able men from the whole number of their tribe, from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to explore it. And they said to them, go and explore the land. And they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to, you might have guessed it, everybody's favorite Motel 6, the house of Micah. I wonder if he had a neon sign that said vacancy, and lodged there. Verse 3. When they were by the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite, and they turned aside and said to him, who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here? You might find it strange that 2 random groups that wind up at Micah's house actually knew each other someplace else. But Israel's not that big. And Zorah and Eshtaol are right on the border of Judah. Bethlehem is not far away at all. So the fact that these 5 men from Dan who are making this exploratory trip happened to run into somebody in Micah's house that they knew from Bethlehem is not that big a surprise. There is one other possibility here. When it says they recognized his voice, the Hebrew would also allow an interpretation. They recognized his accent. He's up in Ephraim, but he don't sound like an Ephraimite. He sounds like he's from the south. In either case, they figured he was not local, and they said, fancy meeting you. What are you doing here? And he said to them, this is how Micah dealt with me. He has hired me, and I have become his priest. I don't think anywhere in all of Scripture up to this point have we ever seen this particular phrase. He's not the Lord's priest. He's Micah's personal priest. I'm his priest. Good to have an attorney on your payroll, and now you have a priest in case you need to do lawyer business with God. He's not representing Yahweh. He's representing Micah. Good thing, because Yahweh would fry him to a fricassee in a moment for being an idol shrine. And so the men from Dan said to him, "Inquire of God, please, that we may know whether the journey on which we are setting out will succeed." People come before idols literally the world over. I took a trip to Asia, Thailand, and Nepal in 1999. And I watched dedicated Hindus and Buddhists kneeling before the shrine and praying before the altars of, they've got something like 600 million gods, so you have a pretty good choice. And here's the basic truth, here's the basic dynamic. You have all these gods, like the Greeks had gods, but the gods are temperamental. Sometimes they wake up on the wrong side of the bed. Sometimes you have to bribe a god or convince a god to do you a favor. You want success in your journey or in some venture, you want a certain girl to love you, then you go to your god and you make a sacrifice, you make a payment, you try to convince that god to extend you a little aid. It's manipulation is what it is. Simple form, it's manipulation. You want good rains, you're a farmer, you want good rains. You go see Dagon because he's the grain god. You try to convince him to like you. It's the way it is. Here are these Danites who have not been able to conquer their territory. Now they're going to look for a new place and they want God to smile on them. So they say to the priest, the Yahweh priest of an idol shrine owned by a guy named who is like Yahweh. And they say to him, "Inquire of God to find out whether our journey will be successful." Well, if they didn't go to this priest, they could have gone to Sister Sophia over in East Lubbock. She's on 34th Street there, and she could probably have told you whether or not your venture was going to succeed. Divination. It took the priest all of one verse to get his answer back from God. And the priest said to them, "Go in peace. The journey on which you go is under the eye of Yahweh." Most versions come up with something a little bit more positive sounding, such as "the Lord smiles" or "the Lord has approved of your journey." But this particular rendering is very, very precise to what the Hebrew says. This is a very, very smart young Levite. He's good with ambiguity. So he says to them, "Go in peace. Your journey is under God's eye." Well, what the heck does that mean? It sounds good. If you want to interpret that as positive blessing, you could do that. But the priest could turn around in a court of law and say, "I didn't actually say that God approved." This is one snaky character. But the Danites were happy. They probably even paid him a little money for the divination. I think everybody was happy, save for God. Verse 7. Then the 5 men departed, and they came to Laish. That means they went north, and they went way north. They went a long way to the north. And they came to the city of Laish, and they saw the people who were there, and how they lived in security, after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth, and possessing wealth, and how they were far from the Sidonians, and had no dealings with anyone. Here is an isolated city sitting on a fertile plain right beneath the highest mountain in the whole area. Well watered because the rivers and streams from off the peak from that high mountain came down and made their land wonderfully fertile. In fact, it was some of the best land in the entire area. They were also like sheep. They were innocent, wide-eyed, unsuspecting people. Supposedly, was it Barnum or Bailey is reputed to have said it's a moral obligation to separate a fool from his money. You know, the Danites looked at them and went, tasty. We can eat these guys and they won't even notice. They don't have any close allies. They have fabulous wealth, fertile land, and no allies. Oh boy. If they were wolves, there would have been big puddles of saliva right below their chins at this point. So verse 8, when they came to their brothers, in other words, they made the return trip back to Zorah and Eshtaol, their brothers said to them, what do you report? They said, arise and let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good. Will you do nothing? Don't be slow to enter and possess the land. As soon as you go, you will come to an unsuspecting people. The land is spacious, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is on the earth. Well, that was a pretty generous interpretation of things. God had indeed given the tribe of Dan a land, and it was not here. It was down south. And they had not been able to conquer it, in spite of the fact that God said, you will not have trouble conquering it. Well, if you mess with idols, you might have trouble conquering it. If you don't put oil in your car, you might have trouble getting past 3,000 miles. But as far as these 5 guys were concerned, the priest had blessed their journey. God was smiling on them. God had shown them door B. There's a good land right up the way. So let's go take it. There is only one problem, of course, and that there are some people living there. And just like we would have had to kill the Amorites, if we had taken the original place that God gave us, we're going to have to kill these folks because they probably won't simply vacate when we ask. Verse 11. So 600 men of the tribe of Dan, armed with weapons of war, set out from Zorah at Eshtaol, and they went up and encamped at Kiriath Jearim in Judah. On this account, that place is called Machane Dan to this day. That means the camp of Dan. It is to the west of Kiriath Jearim. And they passed on from there to the hill country of Ephraim and came, would you know it, to the house of Micah. I swear, this is like DFW Airport. You can't go anywhere in Israel without stopping at Micah's place. Even the rapture is routed through a DFW if you live in the center of the country. Okay, that's not good theology, but anyway.
Well, they say it doesn't matter whether you're going to heaven or hell, you gotta go through that.
So true. So they arrive at Micah's house. Now, there's 600 guys there, right? 600 armed men. They can't all fit. Plus, they had women and children with them, we're about to learn later. So the whole group was probably 1,500, possibly a couple of thousand people. That's a pretty good gypsy encampment on your front lawn. That's all I'm saying. Then the 5 men, verse 14, who had gone to scout the country of Laish, said to their brothers, do you know that in these houses there are an ephod, household gods, a carved image, and a metal image? Now, therefore, consider what you will do. Now, this awkward phrase, a carved image and a metal image, is not, I think, a very good rendering. It's a very literal rendering, but it really misses the point. The 2 words in Hebrew that are rendered a carved image and a metal image, probably, scholars at this point seem to agree, refer more to a single image. It's the idol that was made from the silver, the 200 pieces of silver. And the reason it's described as both being carved and molten or metal is because here's the process. Number 1, the artisan, the craftsman, took a piece of wood and he carved the shape of the idol, a standing figure, figurine, whatever, out of wood. Then, once the wooden figure had been carved out, then the silver was melted down in a molten process. It was made very hot until it was liquefied, and it was poured over the wooden structure so that it was coated in silver. This should be very familiar to us because God's furniture in the temple was done the same way, covered with gold, right? Made out of acacia wood and then covered with gold. Same process. So it's not really 2 different gods or 2 different idols. It is one idol that was first carved and then covered with its metallic sheen or covering, its veneer. So the 5 guys who have already been inside, they say to the other 600, there's some stuff in here you ought to know about. And you know what to do. And we're sitting here going, well, what? We live 2,000, 3,000 years later. Well, but they knew what to do. Verse 15. So they turned aside and they came to the house of the young Levite at the home of Micah, and they asked him about his welfare. Now the 600 men of the Danites, armed with their weapons of war, stood by the entrance of the gate. And the 5 men who had gone to scout out the land went up, and they entered, and they took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, while the priest stood by the entrance of the gate with his 600 men armed with weapons of war. The priest, apparently Micah's, I don't know, off in the South 40. He's not around. Priest comes out, says, "Hi, guys, remember me? I remember you 5 guys." And the priest stays out there with these 600 heavily armed men. And the 5 guys who have already stayed here before, they go in and they clean out the shrine. They go take all the stuff. And the word took here, if I remember correctly, is the very same verb, the very same word that was used when it said that Micah took 1,100 pieces of silver from his mama. Boy, what comes around goes around, doesn't it? Verse 18. And when these went into Micah's house, and they took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, this is the 3rd time in a row he has broken down all this detail. He goes to great lengths to emphasize all this stuff. They cleaned out the church house. They took the microphones. They took the communion set. They took the church. They took it all. Oh, and the altar. They took the altar. They even took the "do this in remembrance of me" table. Well, here they come, walking out, carting all this stuff, and the priest is watching his living, walking away. And the priest says, "What are you doing? What's going on here?" Verse 19, and they said to him, "Shh, keep quiet. Put your hand on your mouth and come with us, and be to us a father and a priest." All right, he's probably aged about 6 months by now. Maybe he's more ready to be a father. "Is it better for you to be priest to the house of one man, or to be priest to a tribe and a clan in Israel? We are offering you a serious upgrade. You have been a pastor of a church of 50, but you could be pastor of a church of 5,000. How about them apples? We'll increase your salary." You just have to sneak away with this real quiet like right now, because we're starting this church with an act of theft. Verse 20, and the priest's heart was glad. You have to love the morals of this Levite. He recognized that this was a promotion. He took the ephod and the household gods and the carved image and went along with the people. He has been in one fell swoop transitioned from being a victim to being one of the guys stealing the stuff. He's one of them now. "Sorry, Micah, I know you've been good to me, but hey, facts is facts." Verse 21, so they turned and departed, putting the little ones and the livestock and the goods in front of them. We are just about out of time, but I'm going to finish this up quickly. When they had gone a distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house were called out. Micah comes home. If you've ever been stolen, you come home and the place is a mess and your electronics are gone. Yeah, like that. So Micah calls out all his allies, and they come out and they overtook the people of Dan. Verse 23, and they shouted to the people of Dan, who turned around and said to Micah, "What's the problem? What's the matter with you? Don't you love it? What is your problem?" And Micah said, "You take my gods that I made, and the priest." In the Hebrew, it literally says, "My gods you took, my gods that I made, you took." Well, Micah, if your gods couldn't keep themselves from being taken, you didn't lose much. "And my priest, you go away, and what do I have left? How can you ask me what is the matter with you?" Well, Micah's complaint was perfectly reasonable. But after all, easy come, easy go. And the people of Dan said to him, do not let your voice be heard among us. They didn't like people talking. They like to tell people, shh. Do not let your voice be heard, because some of these fellows here are angry. And they might get upset and hurt you. Because you just see, it's like one of the Danites puts his arm around Micah's shoulder and he says, come over here. Those guys over there have a bad temper. You might not want to rile. So the people of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned around and went home. You know what makes it even more ironic? They took the idol and they took the other household gods. They took everything. But the idol was made out of what? It was made out of the very same silver that Micah stole from his mom. And now the Danites stole that very same silver, dedicated to Yahweh, from Micah. Verse 27, the people of Dan took what Micah had made, the priest who belonged to him. Notice it's not God's priest, it's the priest who belonged to Micah. God doesn't want anything to do with this. And they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob. Then they rebuilt the city and lived in it. And they named the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was Laish, which means lion, by the way, even though the people were pretty much sheep. And the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses. He waits to the very last part of the story to give you the name of the Levite. Why? Because it was Moses' own grandson who was doing all this crap. Now, he may not have been literally grandson, because these words in Hebrew had more elastic than their English equivalents. He could have been another generation or two down, but he was in the direct line of Moses. It was Moses' own family that was leading Israel into idolatry. Lovely. And he and his sons were priests of the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity, right up until 734 BC, when King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria conquered the northern tribes and carried them all off into captivity. The whole time that there was a temple in Jerusalem, until the northern nation of Israel was gone, the whole time Dan was busy worshiping an idol in an unauthorized shrine. The whole stinking time. And you wonder why God destroyed them. And you wonder why God will judge us. All right, I'm a little over time. My apologies. I haven't done that before, except maybe 2 minutes. This time we're 5. You're going to have to forgive me. I stole 5 minutes, but I will return it, and you can dedicate it to God. Good night, all. We will see you later.
Thank you.
Night, David. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.